But it's not a gold rush. The best projects take time. And they take time because it takes time to prove credibility. So, I think if you're saying to me, what do we need to do? We need to keep at it. We need to scale it, and we need to be patient with it. But it is all of our problem. We all created this. This issue of our planet that we live in.
Welcome to Smarter Markets, a weekly podcast featuring the icons and entrepreneurs of technology, commodities and finance, ranting on the inadequacies of our systems and riffing on ideas for how to solve them. Together, we examine the questions, are we facing a crisis of information or a crisis of trust? And will building smarter markets be the antidote?
Welcome to Demystifying Carbon Markets on Smarter Markets. I'm David Greely, Chief Economist at Abex Technologies. I'm thrilled to have Phil Hardwick here to kick off this series on the carbon markets. Phil is the COO of Base Carbon and has spent the past 2 decades in the carbon markets, working with both carbon project developers and investors to bring investment capital to high-quality projects that reduce and remove carbon emissions to fight climate change. Hi, Phil. Welcome to Smarter Markets.
Thanks, Dave.
You've worked in green finance, carbon, environmental markets for over 15 years, and you've been demystifying the carbon markets for your clients for many of those years, and I'm really happy to have you here today to help do the same for us. It's the first episode of the series, so let's start at the beginning. We talk about carbon markets, plural. There's not a single carbon market, but there are many different markets and types of markets that fall under this broad umbrella of the carbon markets. Can you walk us through the landscape? What are these markets and what do they trade? What are they for?
First and foremost, what are they for? They are for tackling the negative externalities of our existence on this planet. What we do commercially and in our daily lives has a negative impact on our environment. We all know this. And carbon markets or environmental markets are mechanisms that we've developed over the last 20, 30 years of economic thinking that can help use market mechanisms to challenge and address and redress some of these problems. I think when we're talking today, we're really talking about carbon markets. We have had previous environmental markets that tackled acid rain, which were incredibly effective. And carbon markets are what we're using as a term now to tackle the climate change issues created by greenhouse gases. But carbon is the base currency of these gases. Carbon markets could actually mean the emissions from a number of harmful gases, hydrofluorocarbons, methane, and of course carbon. We just use carbon as the base currency. So I think that's the first term for everybody to remember. It's not all just carbon and ignoring methane. Carbon reduction projects cover all of the gases. A couple of terms that crop up are compliance markets and voluntary markets, and carbon offsets and carbon emissions credits. So compliance and voluntary, well, that's relatively straightforward to understand. Voluntary doesn't mean do what you want, and claim that you've done something good. Voluntary markets mean that you are making an action voluntarily, but you follow the rules of the voluntary carbon markets. Compliance markets means there's a law. You're mandated by some law or instruction to behave in a certain way that either generates or provides, credits for your actions. So that's what we mean by voluntary and compliance. Carbon offsets or carbon emissions reductions, as I would prefer to call them, and carbon emissions credits are two quite different things. Carbon emissions credits are those units which are used under cap and trade mechanisms. The most notable cap and trade mechanism is, of course, the EU ETS, which was created by the European Union following the Kyoto Protocol, which opened up the global consensus to use market mechanisms to address climate change. And a cap and trade scheme was adopted in the European Union. Effectively, we set a total limit on pollution, and everybody is doled out tickets to their fair share of that pollution. And we're talking about, in the European Union, over 10,000, maybe 12, 15,000 installations that have some sort of negative environmental impact, they're monitored, and their maximum emission is allocated to them in terms of certificates. If they overpollute, they need more certificates. If they underpollute, they can sell the certificates. But there's no creation of a certificate. They're given out by the state, by the system that's administering the scheme, and then they are traded like a currency in amongst the participants. I think for today's purposes, and what's really a hot topic in capital markets, commodities markets right now is carbon emissions reduction projects. And they can be compliant and they can be voluntary. The most prominent at the moment is the voluntary market. But what we're talking about here is using capital to invest in projects that effectively reduce emissions somewhere outside of your operations or your jurisdiction. So you might be investing dollars into the reforestation of an area that is going to sequester carbon over time, and you're being monitored and you're using those credits as a tangible and fungible unit to put against the commitments that you're making to reduce climate change, but they don't necessarily anything to do with what you do as a day job. So I hope that that clears something up. I mean, this market is, of course, for everybody, but the major participants are, of course, those that pollute the most. And of course, as we know, that's the fossil fuel industry, the heavy industry, the airlines. But as we realise more about our impact on planet Earth, it's increasingly, clear that it's the supply chain for food. It's the multinational companies, and all of us, play a part in that. So the market participants are all of us, but of course, some sectors are far more polluting than others.
Yeah, and over your career, you've worked with all sides of these markets. Can you introduce us to what are some of the roles of the various folks in the markets? What types of participants and what roles do they play? And, what has your role been in these markets?
My role goes back, to my studies of economics at university. And, back then, in the late 1990s, environmental economics was a very small subset of the economics syllabus, but it was one that interested me and one that I studied in and one that I wrote about. Today, if you look at economics courses, they're absolutely full of environmental markets and sustainability courses, which is a fantastic thing. My career, has been in the banking sector and investment banks, and as a consultant and advisor, but always in the field of energy, carbon, clean energy, and commodities. So, that's my background. And as the European Union opened up its EU ETS, as both a cap and trade scheme, but also having fungible carbon offsets within it, the role that I've played is as a project developer. And that is going and finding projects around the world to either invest in or develop from scratch that create emissions reductions, and using either the banks or clients' capital to make sensible, long-term investments into these schemes. But as I said, it's not just a voluntary mechanism where you go out and you say that, oh, we've done this, project and we've reduced emissions and please, believe us. There's a whole infrastructure that underpins these markets. And in fact, the infrastructure for emissions reductions and voluntary emissions reductions goes back to the late 1990s. And it really hasn't changed in its infrastructure particularly much. A methodology is proposed to a registry organisation, and the biggest, most notable and respected at the moment in the market are definitely Verra, the gold standard, and the American Carbon Registry. Those registries and those overseeing bodies will either accept or reject the methodology. They'll put that methodology up for public scrutiny, and it can be peer reviewed, which is a great process. But effectively, at some point, that methodology is accepted or rejected. And once it's accepted, other participants can use that methodology, which is effectively a codification of the rules and assessment criteria for a type of project, and they can implement their own project. And that's how the system worked in the late 1990s, and it's how it works today. In fact, when the European Union, adopted carbon offsets into its cap and trade scheme, making them fungible units, it looked to the voluntary carbon markets for the mechanism. The Clean Development Mechanism of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is effectively the same system as for the voluntary carbon markets, and the same that we have today. what has changed through time is the projects that are used. So the transactions are, either as a legal requirement to create emissions reductions, or they're for your own personal objectives. But the way that they're measured and the way that they're monitored is really not changed.
And it is interesting that there is that symbiosis between the compliance and the voluntary markets. People often think of them as very distinct, but there is a lot of learning and feeding and growing off of each other, as you mentioned as well. I know you don't like the name carbon offsets, as you've said, and I think the preferred would be a carbon reduction project. I think that's right. But when we look out at there are many different types of markets, but also many different types of these carbon offset sources or carbon reduction projects. Could you describe some of these to us? Because I think it's really important, and that many people just think of an offset of like, oh, I'm doing something I shouldn't be doing, or I'm doing something that has a negative impact, so I'm going to do this other thing. But the reductions themselves are projects that are having really positive impact. And I don't think people often get to hear about that who aren't deeply involved in the markets.
That's absolutely right. And I think the point here is not all carbon offsets are created equal. Not all barrels of oil are equal. Not all flows of electricity are exactly the same. And it's the same with carbon market. And, if you're investing in this area, you really do need to understand the difference. The structure of the market, the way that a project is created hasn't really changed, as I said. But if you look 10, 15 years ago, we were able to use carbon finance to fund renewable projects, solar, wind, hydropower. You can still do that today, but they're going to struggle against the test of additionality, i.e., would it not take place without carbon finance? So carbon finance, carbon offsets, carbon emissions reductions, call them what you like. The intention is that they are the catalyst for making an investment happen. If a project or a methodology like photovoltaic stands on its own 2 feet financially, as it does now with the price of PV falling so dramatically over the last decade, you don't need carbon finance. And so you can't claim that it's additional. Equally, you can't have carbon finance if a law is in place to protect an activity or a polluting behavior. So carbon has to be additional. It has to be, the carbon finance has to be the reason that something occurs. And of course, within that spectrum of what types of projects are there, there's a broad range. There's projects that reduce emissions, which is great. It's a very necessary process, and we have to we have to keep reducing or improving our efficiency, in our energy uses. But we also have to remove carbon from the atmosphere or sequester it. So I think if you look at the evolution of projects through the last 10 to 15 years, you get some really interesting stories. As I said, if you looked at carbon portfolio 10, 15 years ago, some of them were entirely made of small hydro in China or wind farms or solar. You really won't find those today, and you will find a lot more nature-based solutions. But in between here and there, we've had some real fallovers. We had a methodology which produced an awful lot of CERs, so that's certified emissions reductions under the compliance scheme of the EU ETS, which was effectively the flaring of hydrofluorocarbons, the gases that are used to make refrigerants, effectively torching that gas as it came out of flow pipes. So, what are you doing there? You're converting HFCs, which are 23,000 times more polluting than carbon, into carbon. So that's a good thing. If you flare HFC, it's less polluting to the environment. But these projects had the perverse incentive of creating more flaring. It's very cheap to flare, and you were getting an awful lot of credits because of the multiplier effect of 23,000 to 1 for doing not an awful lot. And so a lot of money flowed straight into these projects. It looked like a really great way to generate a lot of credits very cheaply. But, time catches up, and, it was soon apparent that these projects were not really delivering the environmental impact that they, were anticipated. So that entire methodology became effectively null and void. And a lot of people who had those in their portfolio or were having future credits were losing money on their investments. So I think, guys like myself and, contemporaries of this market for the last 10 to 15 years are very cautious about which projects we invest in next. And I think, across the nature-based solutions spectrum, you have to be very cautious as well. It's quite clear that planting a tree is an additional behaviour and it will sequester carbon. It's quite clear that delivering cook stoves, reduces the fuel usage of millions of the population and has great additional benefits, to human health. Can we be quite so sure about, protecting rainforests? It's an area of debate for the market at the moment. But, if you're saying that our carbon, finance is effectively protecting a piece of forest, what are you really doing there? You call it a nature-based solution, but really it's a security-based solution. It's guys with guns. And of course, you'll find that a lot of these projects really sell up the sort of SDG side of it. There's a lot of pictures of monkeys and parrots, which give a dopamine hit to the amygdala and make everybody feel great. But if you actually scratch the surface and think about it, that somebody's claiming to be protecting 100,000 hectares of land with carbon finance money, how are they actually doing that? And if you're not actually planting a tree, what are you actually doing that's additional? This area is a massive topic, and we could have a whole podcast on its own on this topic. But, is that really the role of private finance to be involved in those types of projects, or should that be left to the governments? But, there is a huge element of caveat emptor in this market, and you should be doing your research on exactly what types of projects you're investing into, because it's not fully commoditized yet. It trades in very similar ways to soft commodities. There's a vintaging to these credits. They go off over time. Nobody wants emissions credits created in 2008. Everybody wants the ones created today. And of course, there's all the geopolitical risk of where your credit is based. But there is also, the risk which is not obvious, which is 1 tonne of carbon emissions reduction is not the same as the next tonne. It comes from a very different place and is generated by a very different scheme. And so, as I said, caveat emptor to the investors who are looking at those types of projects.
Yeah, it definitely seems like a market where you need to beware and need to have experienced guides to help you negotiate and understand the quality of what you're looking to purchase. When you look across the quality spectrum that's out there today, I've heard you mention, nature-based solutions, cook stoves, and then I think a lot of us will read in, the press about more technological solutions, pulling carbon out of the air and, combining it into rock and carbonates that can be sequestered away. When you look at the supply of projects that are technologically feasible at scale now, is it that more of the high quality are in the nature-based camp and it'll be an evolution to the more technological, or are both of those available now?
I think our evolution is definitely in the nature-based solutions. And I think that our best device for successfully sequestering carbon is currently still the tree or the plant life, or the wetlands or the grasses. The grasses have a huge impact, which we've not particularly, pioneered yet in this market, and it is coming. But yes, the next, the evolution is in the nature-based solutions at the moment. And I think that there's a lot of, investment dollars looking at these areas, clearly, not just in what can we grow or what can we preserve, but what can we do to the soil. Biochar, which is a relatively simple process, of creating charcoal, adding agricultural nutrients to it and planting it in the soil. 1, helps sequester carbon, and 2, creates great knock-on effects for the plant life, the soil, and the fauna that grows there, the flora and fauna that grow there. But yes, that's definitely where we are today. Where we are tomorrow has to be, something more scientific. We know that the cement industry, the building industry, the construction industry are all looking very, very hard at, building materials that sequester carbon by putting, mixing new types of rock into the building materials that can hold the carbon. And of course, we don't know, what the next great invention is going to be, but we keep our eyes on that. And this is what carbon finance is. It's at the vanguard of these developments. It's meant to be there to pioneer the next technologies. It's not there as just a way of permanently being green. Eventually we shouldn't need carbon finance, and we certainly shouldn't need cap and trade schemes. They're catalyzers. But we have to go through this process, and we have to keep moving forwards.
And when you say catalyzer, could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, that's right, Dave. I mean, it is about catalysing investment, and it's about, marginal costs of production. On compliance schemes, it's about forcing behaviour. Increasing the price of the carbon credits means that companies have to invest in new technologies eventually, because the price of the carbon credits is going up and up and up. And you can see that in Europe right now with all, super high carbon prices, which will force behavioural change. In fact, the price of the EU ETS credits right now is so high that it's becoming a political problem. It's, has it gone too far, right? Because you don't want to cripple technology and put it out of business, but you want to force behavioural change. That's marginal cost and marginal abatement. And there's, some fairly rudimentary economic theory that underpins that. In carbon emissions reductions projects, in the voluntary emissions market, in the CDM, it's a similar desired outcome to change behaviour. But the idea is that the money can only be used when it puts an investment, into profit because it's there. So you can get the credit at the end of it, which has a market value, if there isn't already a finance opportunity for this, or if it's not common practice. So we can't use carbon finance for the solar PV on our roofs. One, there's probably subsidies, or there certainly used to be subsidies supporting it. And two, the photovoltaic is just too cheap. That's not a good place for carbon finance. But actually, if we can plant trees, and the fact that we can get carbon offsets or emissions reduction certificates at the end of that, and they have a market value that can be sold, which then means that the investment can take place, it can cover the capex and the opex, and a profit can be made, then that's a fantastic thing, because we really in 25 years have not come up with a better mechanism for taking money out of corporate pockets and putting it against some of the negative externalities that corporates and our behaviour on this planet have created. That's the sharp reality, is that it's a market mechanism that catalyses new behaviours that just simply wouldn't take place in its absence. And this is really the fundamental argument for carbon markets, is that what's the alternative? Because, taxes are avoided and rules are ignored, and, carbon markets are not perfect, but, they've been a long time in development and have, had great impacts and can be improved upon. And it's a case of, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater, but let's just keep developing these markets so that they continue to deliver the kind of behavioural change and investment change that we really, really need. But yeah, carbon finance is not for every scheme that is dreamt up. There's a huge amount of rigour in the process, and it can only be invested for things that really, would not occur without it.
Yeah, and I'd feel remiss right now if I let you go without walking through that. How do you operationalize these transactions and these projects? Could you walk us through, given your experience, what a typical carbon reduction investment or carbon offset transaction looks like? If someone's coming into these markets that, are still developing, I imagine a lot of it's bilateral. You're not just going to go to your, Bloomberg terminal or to a screen and, make a purchase. But how does this work for someone looking to invest or obtain the offsets generated by a carbon reduction project?
Yeah, so there are fairly nascent carbon exchanges occurring now, and that's a necessary development of any market. Exchanges are often the cheapest to deliver outlet, and in this market with such diversity between the projects, the honest truth is at the moment most of the trading is still really OTC. And in fact, if you think that the ultimate buyers of these projects are those companies that have huge net zero targets, they're not in this market to trade per se. That's a byproduct of any market. But their objective is to have emissions reductions projects that they can use for their own purposes. So a lot of the new and good transactions effectively are OTC and may never see the light of the traded market. But yes, as it grows, there is a real movement towards exchanges. One dynamic of the current market is that not a lot had been developed from the end of the EU ETS involvement and until the last few years when we've seen the explosion of net zero targets. So we have somewhat of a huge demand right now, but a production, short. A lot of the credits that are out there are either quite old and not particularly credible, or they're from, methodologies that can produce emissions reductions in scale quite quickly, and there could be issues there. But over the coming years, as that supply begins to catch up, I think you'll see that the exchanges have got a lot more trading on them. They've got a lot more liquidity, obviously, and a lot more differentiation. The market's got a lot more education about what it's buying into. And, and the emissions reductions methodologies that are really credible, as we've seen over the last 15 years, will be the ones that stand the test of time. So, the lessons from the past, are being learnt. The great example that I have is the cook stoves, which is, there really hasn't been a huge amount of criticism of that project methodology over the years. And 15 years later, it's one of the methodologies that still is in place. As I said, solar, wind have pretty much fallen by the wayside and aren't particularly desired anymore. And we have new project types in the nature-based solutions, but the really good ones stand the test of time. They improve, the MRV improves, some of the underlying humanitarian needs for these projects are a different problem that carbon markets can't quite address. But if it's a credible methodology, then it will stand the test of time, and it will eventually find a way onto a traded, exchange market if this process and this growth continues.
Yeah, that's a great lesson that's been learned from the past. And I think, with ESG investing having entered the mainstream in such a big way over the past couple of years, that, of course, we have many investors that are new to the carbon markets, but as you've made clear, the markets themselves aren't new. I've heard many participants refer to carbon markets today as carbon 2.0, or the evolution over the carbon 1.0 markets of the 2000s of that decade. When you look back over the evolution that's occurred, are there any other lessons that you think are important that we learned from what we were doing in the early 2000s that have, need to be remembered today?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we've definitely seen a stampede into certain methodology types that I'm cautious, could be repeated, because we have a lot of new investors now. Carbon 1.0, there were a lot of new investors, and then we got problems with, methodologies like HFC and large hydro, and I'm cognizant that it's easy for that to happen again with the wrong methodologies. And if there isn't much in the market, and there's only red projects out there, that, of course, everybody's going to jump on those. But if we do make mistakes, we mustn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, because really we haven't seen a credible alternative in 25 years. So we've got to just, learn from the mistakes that we will make and keep improving. But yeah, be cautious about the methodology. I think make sure you're investing with a partner and somebody who's got a vested interest in the project. There are a lot of horror stories about brokers in this market, in both the compliance markets and in the voluntary markets. So do your research on who's selling it, and and what, this is one of those markets where you prefer for the person you're buying from to have a vested interest in the project. You really do want that partnership, because these projects can last 10 to 15 years. And if you're serious about, making a difference, it's not a straightforward binary zero-sum game kind of market. You will find people who told you that they have bought carbon credits very cheaply. I've got a project, I'm buying all of it at $5, and that's just, to an experienced market practitioner, that's a red alarm bell right there, because, the world is so connected that it's very clear to the project developer very quickly if the price that they've sold at is off market and that they're being taken for a ride, and it's not a zero-sum game. And what happens, and we've seen this before, is that if somebody loses, they down tools. The project falters, it stops. So transactions have to be progressive. They have to share the revenues, throughout the success of the project. But of course, they need to cover the initial investment and make money. And actually, structuring transactions that do that successfully over time is difficult and challenging, and everyone is different. And that's kind of the expertise that people who have been doing this a long time bring, is that knowing that, everything that glitters is not gold, and that a good project is structured in a very sensible way that shares, risks and rewards. So I think that's very much a lesson from the past that has been learned. But like I said, I think that the structure of these markets hasn't really changed. And that tells us something. One of the most successful products of the 20th century, the motor car, really is fundamentally the same car at the beginning of the 20th century, the same way it works as at the end. But you can't say that we didn't improve it.
And I want to return to that point with the idea that just there's so much demand coming into these markets so quickly that as supply rises to try to meet it, you have to be very careful because it might not be quality supply. So that raises the risks for people coming into the markets. But before, just on, since we're trying to demystify the carbon markets, you mentioned RED projects, which may not be familiar to people. Could you just give a brief overview of what you mean by RED projects?
Yeah, the RED, it's reduced emissions from deforestation. That's what, REDD stands for. Reduced emissions from deforestation means stopping deforestation. Now, of course, one of the great side effects of stopping deforestation is that you protect the habitats. But of course, if you're talking about mature forests without a great deal of growth left to go, it's not actually particularly additional sequestration if they're fully mature, but you're taking credit for the stopping of deforestation. This is quite a divisive topic. For our organisation, we're not particularly keen on that methodology. We don't think that it's absolutely a necessary thing to be done, but we'd much prefer that stayed as the role of governments, which I think if we can't protect our own forests in the way that we would protect our borders, then we have serious issues. And I think that the moral suasion that is winning now to move us towards a more environmentally conscious way of living should be able to make our governments protect those lands. The secondary issues are that if you claim to be protecting 100,000 hectares of land, you're protecting a vast area. We're working on a project at the moment which is reforesting about 30,000 hectares. So that's planting new trees. That's the size of Malta. So if you've got projects out there that are saying, we're protecting 100,000 hectares, 200,000 hectares with carbon finance, you're effectively saying, we're the military, we've got an operation that is is effectively the military operations of a small country. And there's a couple of things there. Is one, have you really? And two, what other problems are lurking when the corporate sector is taking on that role? And so for that reason, we start to put that in the category of the HFC of, okay, is this a bit of a problem waiting to happen? Because to us, whilst you get a great feeling about, thinking that your dollars have protected orangutans and it's absolutely necessary, is it really, an emissions reduction? And is there that page one risk, and that is the COO tapping into his fried egg, his boiled egg in the morning and spitting it all over the front page of the newspaper because there's his company with a real headache, because something's gone wrong with his, security forces in an area of the world which is, impossible to police effectively on at a commercial level. So, that's, I guess, where we're coming from with that one.
Well, that's very helpful and another important lesson from the past that we don't want to forget, because managing risk is an important part of these markets, and the commitments that bring people to these markets need to be met in credible ways with quality projects. I want to return to the point on the demand. You and I have talked about this in the past, and there are a lot of numbers that are put out there in terms of how large these voluntary markets could potentially grow. There are current estimates of around $1 billion a year, and demand around 100 million tons of CO2 per year. Mark Carney's task force on scaling the voluntary carbon markets has estimated that over the next 10 years, it could be a demand of 1 to 2 billion tons of CO2 per year in a 100 billion plus market. So there's a lot of debate about these numbers, but what seems to be clear is that we're probably going to have a lot more demand than we will supply. So what I'm really curious about is, what, in your view, will it take to grow the supply of quality carbon offsets to meet the level of demand that we're likely going to need to meet if we're going to meet these climate change objectives?
First of all, calculating the size of that demand is a really challenging business. If you I can only give anecdotal numbers. And if you look at Microsoft taking their emissions back to 1979 and all of their processes calculated at about 7 million tons, I think that's about 6 months of Qatar Petroleum's offshore activities. And Qatar Petroleum is a fairly, it's a big LNG player, but it's not really, it's not really in the top 10 of oil majors. It's just a phenomenal short position. Then you've got the factor of how much of this is actually going to be offset. We've seen Exxon, make great strides into, the climate change problem, and have said that they, are not particularly keen on using offsets. So if one of the biggest oil players isn't going to use offsets, it's only going to use it for 1 to 2% of its activities. How do you calculate that? So is that the same as Shell? No, I think Shell's far more adventurous in the way it tackles its climate change obligations. You've got so many variables that putting a number on it is really a challenge. But anecdotally, it's definitely huge because the phone is ringing. Our clients have always been the corporate sector, so we get somewhat of a temperature gauge from it, and it is, there is an incredible demand out there at the moment because there's only so much that certain companies can do. If you're a Nestle, you can really start to tackle the seed to shelf activities that you have, and you can make great changes. You can inset. But if you are BP, whilst you are changing from being a fossil company into a renewable energy company, and let's make no bones about it, that's what they're doing. They're not going to reduce their activities such that they can produce clean fossil fuels. They can't. The strategy for our oil sector is that it will not be an oil sector eventually. It will be a renewable energy, sector. Because they physically can't do this. This task is insurmountable. The science isn't there. So they change their business model. What is required is huge, and it definitely needs a lot of work to think about the next technologies. That's the biochars and the technologies that we don't know of. But actually, if we're going to get planting trees, which is, again, going to be challenging because planting trees in the right way is not going to work perfectly every time. Economically, it only just about stacks up at the moment. And when we look at projects and we're looking for conservation trees, there just isn't the data. There's bucket loads of data on commercial trees, eucalyptus, acacia, and all the trees that have been commercially forested. But actually, if you start trying to find data for indigenous species in Southeast Asia, you're scratching through university records, you're scratching through old books, So there's a lot of infrastructural scaling that needs to be required. And there's a lot of patience with the system. And, people have got to be aware that there is no money press here. This is not a printing press of carbon certificates. If somebody's offering you a new carbon project and they're saying that, it's producing credits next year, you really need to do your due diligence because it's a slow process. It can be a very rewarding process, both in the output of what you achieve and also financially. You can set up projects that last a very long time, have a great impact and a great revenue generating models and are good all round. But it's not a gold rush. The best projects take time, and they take time because it takes time to prove credibility. So, I think if you're saying to me, what do we need to do? We need to keep at it. We need to scale it, and we need to be patient with it. But it is all of our problem. We all created this. This issue of our planet that we live in. I think Larry Fink, was it today, even said, it's not about tackling the, climate change. It's about, it's about tackling our existence, because it's not, climate change is about our activity and our existence on this planet. That's what it's about. It's about survival.
Thanks again to Phil Hardwick from Base Carbon. We hope you enjoyed the episode. Join us next week with Mark Lewis, Head of Climate Research at Enduran Capital Management, as we discuss what's gone right, what's gone wrong, and what we can learn from one of the world's leading compliance carbon markets, the European Union's emissions trading system.
That concludes this week's episode of Smarter Markets by Abax. For episode transcripts and additional episode information, including research, editorial, and video content, please visit smartermarkets.media. Smarter Markets is 100% listener-driven, so please help more people discover the podcast by leaving a review on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform. Smarter Markets is presented for informational and entertainment purposes only. The information presented on Smarter Markets should not be construed as investment advice. Always consult a licensed investment professional before making investment decisions. The views and opinions expressed on Smarter Markets are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the show's hosts or producer. Smarter Markets, its hosts, guests, employees, and producer, Abax Technologies, shall not be held liable for losses resulting from investment decisions based on informational viewpoints presented on Smarter Markets. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week.